Good morning. This is the 15th installment of this series. If this is your first visit to the land of the woman with 1.5 hands, it really shouldn't be. Click on over to the first of this series, give it a whirl, then watch part 2, part 3, so on and so forth. Soon, you'll be right back here. Anyway, here's part 15, or the family. Emil Durkheim basically did the same thing with the family that he did with religion. Filled up a variety of petri dishes and then pitted them against each other. Since Durkheim, with religion, has already shown us his methodology, I'll fast forward to his conclusion. Again, it's integration, which is to say, get married and you'll lower your chances of committing suicide. Even better, have kids. Literally, it's the more the merrier. Suicide rates drop with each new addition to the fam. The more people whose lives your life is intertwined with, the more you're dependent upon them and they're dependent upon you, the less chance for suicide. Yes, there are some slight variations, but not worth our time here. In other words, check out Durkheim's book. One conditional exception to the rule in Durkheim's day was that childless wives committed suicide slightly more often than women who were the same age but never married. Thing is, though, 95% of married women then bore children, and childless widows committed suicide less often than women their same age who never married. And there are more exceptions. Point being, the exceptions to the exception to the rule add up and just about but not quite overrule this exception to the rule. In short, this and a couple other long-winded nitpickings are not worth being addressed in this video, but do receive a treatment in my footnotes. Worthy of note, though, is Durkheim's failure to mention abortion. It's not like the procedure hadn't been invented yet. De Sade, in Juliet, wrote about abortion 100 years earlier, a novel where he also brought up dildos, which, again, beyond the scope of the woman with 1.5 hands. I bring up abortion because of how like the opposite of a coincidence it is that the Pope is so adamantly opposed to both abortion and birth control, which leads to Catholics having more children, which is part of the reason they have a lower suicide rate than those with fewer children. I mean, it's not like Durkheim was biased in favor of Catholics, him being Jewish and all. Perhaps whatever statistics he gathered regarding abortion ended up being beyond the scope of his tome. Really, though, it's difficult for me to imagine how those stats, if in fact he did seek them out and found a few, could not have undergirded his main thesis. Catholics, then, would have been against abortion, if you'll pardon my assuming as much, and then in part, because of them having more children, they'd enjoy a low suicide rate. Maybe the reason Durkheim failed to mention abortion in his book on suicide had something to do with him and or Jews in general being pro-choice. Or maybe it's the following. There's a debate that we now think of as the pro-life, pro-choice debate, and as far as their version of this debate went back in the 19th century, Durkheim just didn't want to get involved with that whole debate. Anyway, how this relates to rape prevention is best saved for and can be found in my addenda. But back to the family. It's at this point, after hearing about the suicide preventative propensities of the integration of the family, that an unmarried person might run out and get married, then quickly procreate, and this to lower his/her chances of becoming a victim of suicide. Or for the same reason, governments might change their tax codes, making it extremely advantageous to be married rather than single, to be with child rather than without. Regarding this sequence of events, Durkheim opined that those last few to marry probably aren't doing themselves any favors. If the only reason they get married is to lower their suicide rate, and if they're the sort who, under other circumstances, probably would have never married, and if while single, they've already received 999 paper cuts, so to speak, in other words, they're standing in puddles of gasoline, then married or not, parent or not, if a spark happens, they're still much more likely to combust than those standing in puddles of water. I think Durkheim here was reiterating how depression rates and suicide rates don't necessarily march in lockstep. Similar to this is his stance on education. If the underlying issues aren't addressed, more education isn't going to help. Simply put, getting married is not going to make that puddle of gas evaporate overnight. After all, it took a lifetime for it to accumulate. Here one might ask, okay, bottom line, which is it? Is belonging to a highly integrated family an effective counteragent in terms of these underlying issues or not? Durkheim answered this by saying that an individual decreases his or her chances of committing suicide with each act of 1. Getting married, 2. Having a child, 3. Having another child, 4. Staying married, i.e. not getting divorced, not becoming a widower, and 5. Go back to step 3, which is have another child, stay married, have another child, stay married, and so on. However, the professor wrote, that still doesn't address our bigger concern, namely, the same ratio of single people to married people existed in the 1820s that existed every decade thereafter, all the way through the 1880s. During this time, suicide throughout Europe rose about 2% a year on average, and eventually tripled. Singles gradually committed suicide more and more. Married folks, same. It's not like the suicide rate for singles sextupled and the suicide rate for married people stayed the same. Nope, they both climbed at almost exactly the same rate. In other words, Durkheim wrote, the song remains the same. Why has suicide tripled? To help answer this, I'll soon explore a third area of integration, having to do with one's nation. First, though, it should be noted that Durkheim alluded to a normal or usual or acceptable level of suicide, and that self-murder had at times, quote, been called the ransom money of civilization, end quote. Here, he looked back thousands of years, noted various spikes and troughs, but ended up stressing that what happened between 1500 and 1820, virtual stagnation, was the norm, and that history had never before recorded a constant upswing, an uptick that lasted for decades. And in other words, this steady increase, Durkheim noted, is symptomatic of a pathology. This is another Durkheimian principle that I don't think is transferable to rape prevention. Extinction is not really on the horizon, at least not due to a lack of propagation. Even if that were the case, though, I still don't see an acceptable level of rape other than 0. The anti-rape industrial complex, on the other hand, while paying lip service to this same notion, acts as though there were a nice, low, acceptable number of rapes, and that it's more than 0. That they know it's more than 0, and how they know so is about to be substantiated. That TARICO brass act as though sacrificing a few is a reasonable trade-off for the many. In other words, pay out the ransom money, reap the benefits of modern civilization, will be spelled out before the end of this series. That ought to do it for this time. Next time, part 16, or War.